Hello, my name is Dr. Jo White. I'm a clinical psychologist and advanced certified schema therapist and supervisor. A really common dilemma to come up during training and in supervision is where to put the chairs when you're doing chair work with a coping mode or with the critic mode. And so I've created this short presentation, 10 minutes, just to give you some tips around where to put the chairs. So why does it matter where we put the chairs? So first of all, we can create a therapy team with the healthy adult when we consider where we're positioning our chairs. It allows us to connect with the vulnerable child mode if we're thinking about positioning. We can also demonstrate the power of a mode in somebody's life by using the position of the chair to represent the size of that mode, the way in which that mode might interact. And so we can illustrate how the mode might also block connection. For example, if we're thinking about the detached protector and how that might block our connection as a therapist with the part of the client that feels the vulnerable child mode. So in this video, I'm going to be thinking with you around how to do chair work with the critic mode and with the coping mode, and where we put the chairs for doing these exercises. So you can use exactly the same chair setup for both of the exercises, both chair work with the critic mode and chair work with the coping mode. What if you don't have enough chairs in your office? So this is a really common dilemma, people not having enough chairs. Well, really don't worry about that. You can use, for example, the bin to represent the critic mode. I think that's a really good option. Or you can use a piece of paper on the floor with the name of the mode written on that piece of paper. When you ask your client to move into that mode, then making sure that you're orientating them each time to the mode that you want them to be speaking from, or the mode that you're speaking to. And you might have to orientate them during the exercise as well. But it's really important that both you and your client are clear about which mode you're talking to or which mode they're talking from. And when you ask them to move into that mode, then you want them to talk as if they're the mode. So that's a way of kind of personifying the mode, which allows us to sort of create some diffusion or separation between how the healthy adult thinks and is motivated, and distinguish that from how the coping mode or the critic mode is thinking and what their motivation is. Okay, so thinking about the position of your chairs. So if you see at the bottom of the image, we've got the client's chair and the therapist's chair. So assuming this is how you might normally sit in your therapy room. And the first step you want to do is to pull up a chair for the critic mode or the coping mode that's sort of opposite both of you. And then the second step is to create a therapy team by pulling those chairs together. So on the left, you've got a chair that represents the parts of the clients that feel. So their vulnerable child mode or their healthy adult mode. So keeping it simple and just using the same chair for both of those modes. And then you've got the chair for the therapist, where the therapist is both modelling healthy adult to their client and coaching the healthy adult. So from this chair, you're creating together a therapy team where you're working to support your client to be in a team with you to challenge the critic mode or the coping mode. And then you ask your client to move to the critic or the coping mode chair. So they move across to that chair, and when they move across, then they talk as though they are the critic mode or the coping mode, and they're talking about themselves. And so the therapist hears from the critic mode. We don't tend to interview the critic mode at any length. We just want to get a sense of what the critic mode is saying about the individual, what they're saying about how they're behaving, how they're feeling, what their thoughts are. Or you can use this position as well when you're interviewing a coping mode. And so that might be more when you're asking about where does this coping mode come from? When did it first come about? So the therapist is hearing from the critic mode or asking some questions of the coping mode, and the client's sitting in that chair and responding. The only time when I wouldn't ask a client to go and sit in the coping mode chair, in the critic mode chair, is if I'm really concerned about the client becoming very, very fused with the critic mode. So some clients, when they become very fused with the critic mode, can get quite destructive and can find it really, really hard to separate again from that mode and to leave it behind in the chair. And so what I tend to do in those circumstances is ask the client to tell me what the critic mode is saying. And so they stay sitting in the therapy team right next to me, and I ask them, okay, what's the critic mode saying? When it's time to challenge the mode, then you always get your client to come and move back next to you. So they want to move back into the vulnerable child or the healthy adult mode chair. So back into that therapy team, because you never ever challenge a chair with a client sitting in it. So you never challenge a mode with a client sitting there, because that will either scare the client, because we're taking quite a firm stance potentially with the critic mode, or will activate some defensiveness for the client if we're challenging the ways in which they're coping. And so we ask the client to move back to the chair next to you, and then together you can challenge the critic mode or the coping mode chair, and that distance makes it much easier for a coping mode to be challenged without creating defensiveness. And so from this position, the therapist can turn to their client who's sitting in the vulnerable child chair, and connect using a soft tone of voice and those lovely limited reparenting messages. So being in that close proximity to a client sitting next door really lends itself to being able to connect with the part of them that's feeling. And this position can also be used, the therapy team position, to coach the client to challenge the critic mode or the coping mode. So the therapist from this position might be feeding lines to the client. So ways of challenging the critic mode, can you tell them to stop saying this, to stop talking to you like this? And so feeding the lines to the healthy adult of the client that the healthy adult can then challenge the critic mode with. And you might well be using this position to encourage a client to say the things that they want to say. So that tends to come a bit later in therapy. I wouldn't expect a client to be able to challenge their critic mode or their coping mode early on in therapy. That's where the therapist is modelling that for a client. But later on, it can be used as a way of, we're sitting next door to our clients, we're supporting them, and we're coaching them to use their own healthy adult to manage those modes. Okay, so in summary, you use the same chair setup for whether you're working with the critic mode or whether you're working with a coping mode. Keep things simple. You only ever challenge an empty chair. Think about your tone of voice and the proximity that you're in for connecting with the vulnerable child mode. And then using that therapy team position for coaching the healthy adult mode so that you're really alongside them and together you're working on developing new ways of managing. If you're lacking in confidence transferring chair work from in the room to online, or you're finding that it's a bit clunky when you do so, or maybe you're totally avoiding chair work online because you're just not sure how to make it work, then you might like to join me for a workshop that I'm running in January, which is all about transferring chair work from in the room to online settings. So whether you're working telehealth or on Zoom, we're going to be looking at chair work with the critic mode, chair work with the coping mode, how to connect with a vulnerable child and the healthy adult when you're working online, and also how do you mode map with chairs when you're working online. So it would be great to have you join me, and you'll find a link to the workshop on my website, which is www.schematherapyworks.co.uk, and I'll put a link in the comments to the workshop sales page. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that and get going using some of those tips around how to position chairs for chair work.